And welcome back to the Financially Simple Podcast. I'm your host, Justin Goodbrad, and today we're going to deal with a fun topic. I'm excited about my guest. Let me tell you about the guest today. I'm so excited. I'm honored that my friend David Stein would take some time out of his busy schedule, traveling the Wild West, to join us on the Financially Simple Podcast. I met David virtually about 4 years ago. You see, whenever I was looking in the world of finance, I had this idea of starting a podcast. I had this idea of teaching. And at the time when I was listening to podcasts, there were a lot of people out there who had guest style podcasts, where they bring somebody on, they ask them questions, and then they sign off, they bring another guest on, etc. I love to teach. I love to give in-depth topics. In fact, if you listen to the first 260 episodes or so of the Financially Simple Podcast, you realize it's me teaching everything from business finance to personal finance, trying to help you business owners rock it out and double your net worth every 3 to 5 years. And I sincerely believe you can do that. I ran across this podcast called Money for the Rest of Us. And this guy, David Stein, began teaching. And it wasn't, hey, let me show you how to get out of debt. It was really deep information. I came across one particular episode, though, episode number 94. And whenever I heard David speak about the Federal Reserve and the monetary system of our country, and for that matter, several different federal monetary systems around the world, I got to tell you, friends, I had to listen to that podcast about 4 times before I could really grasp the magnitude of David's intellect and what he was dealing with. It was profound to me. It was profound in the matter I've never heard anybody speak about that subject so clearly and so simply. So I became an instant fan of Money for the Rest of Us. I have listened to almost, I think, every podcast. I have purchased David's book, which you can find on Amazon and Audible, called Money for the Rest of Us, 10 questions to master your success. 10 questions to master successful investing. So let me tell you, I am honored. The podcast would not be here today without my guest, David Stein. David, man, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast.
It's great to be here. Thanks for having me, Justin.
So, buddy, let's talk about the stimulus package, and let's specifically talk about this idea of how money is made. Does the federal debt really matter, and what does it mean for you or I, or for that matter, our grandkids? So let's chase that rabbit a little bit. So, David, I guess the first question is, what is money?
Well, money's trust. So if you pay for something with money, they have to believe that whatever you gave them has some value that they'll be able to convert it to pay somebody else. And so that, money over the years, different things have been used for money, but in our current monetary system in the US, money is the dollar. And what is a dollar? A dollar, you pull a dollar bill. It's a non-interest bearing perpetual liability, essentially debt of the Federal Reserve. It's just debt, essentially. And so when we think about money, money is a means of exchange. You can exchange it with somebody for goods and services. It's a unit of account. We use money on your accounting statements for the businesses that you work with, your listeners. It's denominated, if you're a U.S. business, denominated in dollars. And then ideally, it's a store of value. It will maintain its purchasing power over time, something that the dollar hasn't done a great job of. It's done better than other currencies. Lebanon, I talked about them in my show last week. They basically just cut the value of their currency in half. But with inflation, just the increase of the amount of dollars, the money supply in the world over time, that does lead to some price rises. And so it doesn't maintain its value perfectly, but generally does okay. And so that's what money is. It's created by banks. Over 90% of the money supply is created by banks in the US. That money's the dollar money supply. And your listeners are sophisticated business owners. They ought to be able to grasp the accounting. When a bank makes a loan, what does it do? You sign the loan document, and on their balance sheet as an asset, they have a new loan receivable. On the liability side, they create the deposit. That's essentially it. So, asset, you got your debits must equal your credits. That's what happens at the bank level. Then that person will generally spend that money, and then so the deposit leaves. But in aggregate, that act of banks, there's a phrase that called loans create deposits. And that's effective because money it can be created out of thin air just in that accounting, because that's what money is. It's a unit of account. That accounting creates money. And so in aggregate, if all those banks are creating money by making loans, that's what causes the money supply to increase. That's the primary way it happens.
Whenever the bank, Federal Reserve, et cetera, is creating dollars, we often hear it, at least I'm going to be very simple here in my terms, as creating dollars out of thin air. We talk about the stimulus that just happened here in the last, 69 days. And now Congress, as we're recording this in mid-May of 2020, Congress is now proposing perhaps another stimulus with trillions of dollars. I mean, the number to me is mind-boggling. Whenever they are printing dollars, as we often use in slang acronyms, are printing dollars, is that just literally creating like dollars out of thin air? I mean, you and I can't do that. We can't just go out and make money up. Is it just putting more assets on the balance sheet without creating a liability? Talk to me around this idea of the creation of dollars. How does it work?
Well, first off, my first discussion that the commercial banking system creates dollars through lending. What you're referring to is how does the Federal Reserve create dollars, which is a completely different, sometimes it's called quantitative easing,
Right.
But it essentially is asset purchases. The Federal Reserve also has a balance sheet. They have assets, which is primarily at this point U.S. Treasury bills. They have a little bit of gold, but mostly U.S. Treasury bills. And then they have deposits, reserves. Basically, commercial banks have accounts at the Federal Reserve, just like we have an account at our bank. The commercial bank has an account at the Federal Reserve, and the U.S. Treasury Department has an account. They have deposits at the Federal Reserve too. So what the Federal Reserve has bought over $2 trillion of new Treasury bills in the last 6 to 8 weeks. How did they do that? They work through the commercial banks. Generally, it's done through the New York Fed. A commercial bank will sell them that Treasury bond. And the way that it works is the Federal Reserve literally does create the money. All they do is they deposit the amount of money that they bought for that Treasury bond in the reserve account of that commercial bank. And then it's offset by the new asset that the Treasury or that the Federal Reserve has, which is the Treasury bond. And so when we talked about the Federal Reserve, expanding their balance sheet, it's gone from effectively $4 trillion to over almost $7 trillion now, will quickly be $10 trillion in assets. That's all they're doing. They're creating new bank reserves as they purchase these assets through the central bank or through the commercial banking system. Now, individuals we sort of think, well, is this money all going out into the economy? It really isn't, in the sense that somebody effectively sold a Treasury bond to a commercial bank and got money for it. It was an asset swap for them. That the private sector isn't any richer because all they did is they sold Treasury bonds and they got money. Just like we sell any asset, you get money for it, and that's what's happening. But it's done through the Federal Reserve, and so they're effectively they're buying Treasury bonds with the idea to, one, create liquidity so that the bonds trade and so we don't get interest rate spikes, but also to put some downward pressure on interest rates. But they're a huge buyer of Treasury bonds. So in the last year, the U.S. government's run about $1 trillion deficit. And the U.S. Treasury has basically bought over $1 trillion worth of Treasuries. So we talk about, is the debt being monetized? That's what monetization is. If you have a central bank that can create money and it's buying Treasury bonds and it's more than the net issuance of Treasury bonds, that's what monetization is.
So perhaps we can give a little bit of history here, David. Here in East Tennessee, we're in the conservative part of the country, if some people would call us. We're in the Bible Belt, is another term that people use here. I can remember when I first moved here from South Georgia up to Knoxville, this idea that I ran this radical group of people that talked about we've removed ourselves from the gold standard. And I grew up in St. Simon's Island, Jekyll Island, Georgia. And for those history buffs, they realize that the Federal Reserve was actually created on Jekyll Island, Georgia. In fact, there's several books written called The Monster from Jekyll Island. A little history here might be helpful to compare that the way that the government works is not the way that our businesses work or our pocketbooks work. I can't personally, I wish I could sometimes, but I can't personally go out and create new dollars. That's not something that I can do. I think if you try to do that, you'll go to jail. Personally, I've actually heard a young group, a young couple in a college dormitory that decided they were going to print money on their printer, and the FBI didn't like that too much, so they tried to create their own dollars. If we look back in history, we have this idea amongst business owners that we've removed ourselves from the gold standard, and therefore money is useless. Maybe we could spend a little bit of time here kind of talking just superficially, if you will, on the kind of how we've arrived where the Federal Reserve and the banking system can use quantitative easing to help our economy at this point. Does that my question make sense?
Well,
there,
right,
David?
right. Well, first off, I mean, you could create money if you wanted, not dollars, but if you could convince people to take monopoly money for something to buy, because money, the dollar, has no intrinsic value. It is worthless, except that we make it worth something because we believe in it. We have trust in this dollar. Now, the dollar, we used to be on the gold standard. So the dollar was backed by gold up until the early 1970s. There are some challenges to backing your currency with gold is you have to find the gold. And so it limits the amount of money that can be created. And the process of trying to keep your currency pegged to gold, and when you get new gold being mined and people buying gold, it effectively makes your monetary system, you're making decisions to defend the price of your dollar relative to gold, rather than, for example, if gold starts flowing out, people want to go to the central bank, they could exchange it for gold. The way that you try to convince them to not do that is you could raise interest rates so that they can earn more money. So they don't want to cash in for gold because gold doesn't yield anything. So what happens is then the central bank has to suddenly be making interest rate decisions to keep gold from flowing out of the central bank, rather than making decisions to stimulate additional demand to encourage people to borrow. And so one reason countries have gotten off the gold standard is it gives them more flexibility to adjust their monetary policy, interest rates, to help the economy, as opposed to having their economy basically held hostage to keeping the dollar at the right price relative to gold. And that's effectively why we went off the gold standard. Now, it provides flexibility, but we can create too many dollars. I mean, that's one of the roles of the Federal Reserve, is to make sure that banks are not lending too much. Banks lend too much in a time where, factories are running full tilt, where there's full employment, and then you have people still borrowing money and at creating money, that money's flowing into the economy based on commercial bank lending. That's what causes inflation. You get these capacity constraints, you get too much money. And so one of the jobs of the Federal Reserve is to keep price stability, make sure we're not creating too much inflation by creating too much money. And the way that they do that is by adjusting interest rates, short-term rates, and influencing longer-term rates. And that's a big component. Your other role of the Federal Reserve is stable employment. So they have kind of this dual mandate: keep everybody that wants a job can get a job, make sure that interest rates are appropriate so that there's not too much bank lending, hence inflation.
One of the things that I'm often hearing as we talk about the Federal Reserve, and now this two-pronged approach, is dual role, as you call it. People often measure the success, at least as I hear it, David. Maybe you hear things differently on the West Coast, but in the East Coast here, as people are judging the Federal Reserve, they often are looking at the published national debt. And they're saying, okay, we're currently, as we're recording this episode, $25 trillion in the published national debt. And here Congress, yet as of yesterday on the Wall Street Journal, is talking about perhaps another $2 or $3 trillion of debt that we are printing toward our government balance sheet. Does that really matter to me as a business owner, or to me as a consumer, or to me as an American citizen? Does the debt even matter?
Well, Yeah, it matters. It's $23.2 trillion dollars, and about $15 trillion dollars of that is owned by private investors. What is debt? I mean, it's a government debt, but it's our asset. We earn interest on it. People own the debt because they want to earn money. And people worry about, well, how are our grandkids going to pay off this debt? Have you ever had to pay off the national debt? Anybody come to you to the way to collect? No, it just doesn't happen. Where it gets to be an issue is if we lose trust. Nobody knows how much debt is too much when it comes to the government. We know how much debt can be too much for private business because the debt isn't denominated, it's denominated in the dollar. But if a debt is denominated in a currency that you control and make up, then the limit is trust. It's not, there's no fiscal limit. There's no default risk limit because the limit becomes inflation, too much money being created. So from that aspect, right now, a total federal debt, so public and private debt, including the debt that, so the Social Security Trust Fund owns a fair amount of it. The federal pension employees have treasury bonds. So it's about 106% of gross domestic product, or basically the output of the economy. It was 119% in 1946, at the end of World War II. So it's been higher.
Right.
Net debt, so you back out what the government owes itself, which isn't really debt. If you owe yourself, it's like borrowing from your 401k, right? You owe yourself. It's about 80% of GDP. But nobody knows what it is, like how much is too much. I mean, the key to pay down the debt, well, what matters is, what is it relative to the economy? Is it getting to the point where it's just people are starting to freak out and making purchase decisions because they're worried about the national debt, or hoarding things because they're worried about inflation? But last year, the interest rate average cost, they paid about $375 billion in interest, the government did. It's about a 1.65% interest rate they paid. Now it's less than 1%. In order to pay off the debt or pay down the debt, they're never going to pay it off. In order to reduce the debt relative to the size of the economy, you effectively need your economy to grow faster than as a percent. Basically, so we got about a $20 trillion economy, GDP on a nominal basis. If that can grow at 4% per year and the deficit is only like 3% of the economy, then you effectively are paying down the debt as a percent of GDP because you're growing your economy faster than the debt's growing. And so that's how it'll happen. Now, one way it could happen is inflation could pick up. I mean, it could be monetized that way. So let's say inflation's running at 4%. So, well, nominal GDP is growing faster. It's just like for all of us. If inflation is higher, it's easier for us to pay off our mortgage debt because that stays the same. Works the same way for the government. Now, we don't know if that'll happen or not. Again, it's not easy to create inflation. I mean, we've seen that the Federal Reserve has fallen short of their 2% target for many years now because it depends on businesses willing to borrow or willing to invest, produce capacity. And so that it is complicated, but it all kind of ties together. But I'm not overly worried about the national debt. I focus on what is inflation. I focus on what interest rates are because that's a big component. There's an aspect of interest rates. It's called a term premium, which is basically additional yield that the market demands because they worry about the Federal Reserve and they worry about inflation. And term premiums have been effectively zero for many years now. People don't seem to be worried about it. So if people start to worry about it in terms of their actions, then I'll be more worried. Now, having said that, how do you protect yourself? Don't keep all your money in dollars at the bank. Own some real assets. Business that can produce dollars is a great resource. Own some gold. Gold's a monetary asset. It's had a good year. It doesn't yield anything, so there's some downsides to that. But you can own some gold. You can own some rental real estate. You can own some land. So assets that are not just, I mean, they might be accounted in dollars, but it's not money at a savings account. And that's important.
What's interesting, David, is as you're going through that, you're talking about some of the same things that Chris Stewart, our CFA, that's on our resident CFA, who actually served on the Federal Reserve or worked for the Federal Reserve Board as the in the management side of the Federal Reserve. We're actually going through a little bit of the of what you just spoke toward in our next podcast that we're recording actually later today. As we look at this, though, I think I agree with you in the sense that I'm personally not worried about the national debt. I agree with you in the sense that I love to track the inflationary number. We have to do so for the planning for our business owners to make sure they can achieve their success, their dreams, their hopes, their wishes. I also love the fact, and if you listen to any of my podcasts, I'm not a big Wall Street type person. I think Wall Street for business owners is often the enemy, in my personal opinion. I love the fact that we can use our businesses, real estate, gold, other types of asset classes in parentheses to help hedge ourselves. But as we are talking with business owners, one of the questions that I have come up consistently is this: Justin, because of the printing of dollars, that's the phrase I use in air quotes here as we're doing this. By the way, friends, check us out on YouTube. You can see us on YouTube on the video here as well. I hear, Justin, because because the government is printing the dollars of 3 trillion, 2 trillion, maybe more now in this short time period, should I conduct my business affairs differently now because of this crazy national debt than perhaps I did a year ago? How would you answer that crazy question?
I think as a business owner right now, the national debt is the least of the worries. Where I'm not sure when you'll publish this. It doesn't matter when you publish it. We'll still be dealing with the pandemic, right? Most of the economy was shut down for the coronavirus, COVID-19. And in my view, that's not going away anytime soon. I mean, that's just not how epidemiology works. And so as business owners, we need to figure out, how am I going to serve my customer in a way that it doesn't matter whether the government shut down or shut down the economy. People were sheltering in place before governments shut down the economy because this is an uncertainty. This is not a risk. The coronavirus is not a risk. It's not like you can get insurance where you can figure out, well, here's the probability that you're going to get in a car wreck or some type of liability. We can't calculate the risk of this virus yet. And so people are doing what they should. They're being cautious. And so as a business owner, how do we help and serve our clients while they're being cautious and focus on self-preservation? I mean, that's the biggest concern. I mean, the national debt, don't worry about it right now. Inflation, if it comes up, I mean, inflation just doesn't happen overnight. You'll see inflation happen. If it happens, it happens more gradually. I mean, sometimes it can spike, but ultimately, you can own other assets. You can diversify your asset base, focus on serving your customers, and focus on trust. Do people continue to trust the Federal Reserve? Because one of the things that I've learned really and focused on in the last even month or two was the idea that commercial banks have all this money at the Federal Reserve. They have a deposit account. They don't have to keep that money there. They have some minimum that they have to keep. But if commercial banks suddenly felt like the Federal Reserve was a Ponzi scheme, let's say the Federal Reserve lost money doing all this lending they're doing to businesses. And so then they try to cover the losses by they print more reserves, and commercial banks start to worry about, well, how valuable is these reserves, and start wanting to cash them out for real dollars, like currency, printed dollars. I mean, those are the things that concern me. And those are all trust issues where commercial banks don't trust the Federal Reserve, where the consumers don't trust the dollar anymore. We're not there yet, but it could happen. It's a possibility.
Oh, we've seen that happen globally in a couple of other countries here in our recent history, even, and how fast trust unwinds. I mean, we see it oftentimes in businesses. I dealt with an episode about how trust can lead to legal issues, spousal issues, et cetera. But the same is true, David, in our economy. So you were talking about tracking that trust factor. If somebody wanted to track, let's say, inflation, or somebody wanted to track how the consumer base of our economy were actually their trust was being weighed, where would somebody go to follow that, or how would you go about tracking the trust level, air quotes again,
Well,
of our?
you would, yeah, you'd one, focus on interest rates. Are you starting to see 30-year Treasury bond rates rise? To where if you look at, we know what the actual inflation is. We know basically you can take the nominal yield on treasuries, you can back out the inflation rate, whatever it is, and that gets you a real rate. So if real rates start to rise because that term premium is increasing, people want more money for protection, that would be a sign that the rates are rising even higher than they would, even if inflation is low. So that's important. If you start, I mean, a lot of it's anecdotal. Like, what are you seeing in the news? What are your business associates saying? If people, I mean, a lot of people talk about the national debt. You see a lot of people talking about, we're worried about commercial banks pulling all their money out of the Federal Reserve, or the Federal Reserve is insolvent, or it's a Ponzi scheme. I mean, most people are not, or are they acting like it? If anything, there's a dollar shortage right now because there's been so much overseas borrowing. Businesses overseas for whatever reason, want to borrow in the dollar because they feel it's more stable. And that's the important thing about currencies. People always worry about, well, what happens if the dollar crashes or there's a currency crash? Well, it has to crash relative to something. We have to conduct business in some currency. So is it going to crash relative to the euro, which is, they got a lot of debt in Europe, to the yen? They have way more debt than the US does. And so the dollar is a reserve currency because people choose to use it. They choose to hold it. They choose to transact in it. And if maybe that will change, but for now it's not. We want to protect ourselves by having these other diversifying real assets, monetary assets, but by and large, focus on your business. That's where the big challenges are right now for our economy.
So with that statement, David, let's bring this plane to the ground. Okay. So one of the questions I often ask any guests I have on the show is to provide one word of wisdom with what we're dealing with in our situations today. The listener base are typically going to be service style industries. They're, entrepreneur doctors. They are selling some sort of a retail position. They're not manufacturing, is what we're seeing on our demographic, that actually the people who listen to the show, they're typically service industries. And with that in mind, David, and you've got, male, female, all across the country and around the world to listen to the podcast, what would be the one pearl of wisdom that you would give to business owners at this particular point? As we're recording this in mid-May, it'll be released sometime in the next 2, 3, 4 weeks. So sometime in May. What's that one pearl of wisdom? If you said, hey, I'm going to leave you with this from my perspective and all the knowledge that I've heard that you have and your perspective, what would that be?
I'd reinvent your business. Figure out, how am I going to serve my customer when they're afraid to leave the house because out of self-preservation, or they're hesitant because maybe, hopefully this pandemic will end. Hopefully it'll die off in the summer. I would act like it's not. How will I run my business if it doesn't end, if there is a flare up in the fall? And how can I run my business so people feel more confident to come to my medical practice? Or the biggest hit to GDP in the first quarter was healthcare. And it was because people chose not to pursue elective things. They got sick, they went. But so those are the type of things. Like, and I know in our business, we're focusing on, well, how do I want to take this time? It's kind of a pause. We've been sheltering in place for 2 months. How do I want to reinvent and reinvest for what I believe is a very, very different world? We're seeing it. I mean, there's a reason why the Federal Reserve is doubling their balance sheet. Jay Powell, the Federal Reserve chair, gave a speech yesterday where he talked about 40% of households that made $40,000 or less in February, they were working. The unemployment rate's 40%. 40% lost their jobs, making less than $40,000. I mean, we've not seen anything like this in our history. And it's not, I mean, hopefully the vaccine will come, we'll get some, but this is different. We should act like it is.
Well, friends, my guest today, as you've heard me say, is David Stein. Money for the Rest of Us is his podcast. You can check out moneyfortherestofus.com. David, if somebody had some questions for you, would you direct them? Where would you direct them? If somebody said, "Hey, man, I love listening to you. I want to learn more about what your ministry is, so to speak." How would you have people connect?
Sure. Website's moneyfortherestofus.com, and I'm also on Twitter at JD Stein. But that's the website. It's the best place to start.
David, thank you so much for being on the podcast today. You've helped me. Those were some tough questions. I'm sorry to throw you there. I knew you could handle it. Hey, friends, I really challenge you to go check out his podcast. Like I've told you this before. You've read his name in our blog. I've mentioned podcasts that he has done. He is, to me, David is just triumphing so much in the world of finance. And buddy, I'm honored to have you on the show today. So friends, as we sign off here, look, I realize that life is hard. You know, David even alluded to that today, that some of the things we're still uncertain about with the COVID-19, we have some uncertainty ahead. I realize life is hard, but man, life is good. Life is good. The sun rose today and the birds are still singing. Life is good. And life can be frustrating. It can be. Trying to deal with the Federal Reserve, oh my goodness, man, it makes you want to do something stupid. Don't do it. But it does. It makes you go crazy. Life is frustrating. Money doesn't have to be. Money doesn't have to be frustrating. We're going to continue to make our lives at least financially simple. Hey, y'all go out and make it a great day.